Hey everyone. So this episode is in response to a lot of questions that I've been getting about autistic experiences of Pentecostalism. Just before we start the episode, I had a few audio issues that I couldn't quite resolve here, so the audio quality on this episode may not be the best. And as you will be able to tell during this episode, Ian had a sick kid who coughed quite a few times. I managed to clip some of that out, but wasn't able to get all of it. Maybe in a future day when I have good editing skills, I'll be able to do that better. But for now, you're just going to have to sort of deal with it. I apologize in advance. Anyway, that's that. Let's get into the episode. So, in the actual main podcast that we ran, me and Amy talked all about autism and Christianity, and we talked about the various intersections of autism and Christianity. But there was one particular intersection that me and Amy didn't spend a whole lot of time talking about, and that was mostly because we just didn't have time to. The podcast itself already, I think the runtime was like 30 hours. I wanted to try to keep it like a reasonable amount of time that you could feasibly listen to without going down all the rabbit holes. But now that main podcast is done, I want to actually explore a lot of the rabbit holes. And one of the rabbit holes that we overlooked was Pentecostalism, or the intersection between Pentecostalism and autism. And so for that, I have a special guest. His name is Ian, and I'll just let him introduce himself.
This is my first podcast appearance. Hello, everybody. I am Ian Caveney, and I have a master's degree in history of religions from the University of Chicago. But actually, probably the real reason John brought me on to chat about Pentecostalism is that in my heart's heart, I'm a Pentecostal. I'm one of those people. I was raised in a kind of mainline Christian household, a kind of liberal Methodist background, but I didn't quite understand that to be like my faith tradition or even something that was living for me until I had really a Pentecostal revival in high school. I had a crush on a girl. She brought me to her youth group, and they were talking about Christianity in this kind of real way that I never understood before. And that's when I decided this is my thing. I want to be this. I want to embrace this Jesus in the way that they're talking about. And from high school and for the next 10 years, I was like very much a full throated Pentecostal in multiple different kinds of church contexts. And even though now I don't quite identify with that part of Christianity, there's still so many foundations that are still there for me. But ever since then, I've been doing like graduate work and I've been doing academic work, and I've been asking myself a lot of historical questions. Like, what was this thing I was a part of? How does it work theologically? How does it work experientially? And fairly recently discovering that I'm on the autism spectrum and asking questions about the intersection between that and that experience. So I'm glad that you brought me on, John. I'm excited to chat about this.
Yeah, great. So I think probably the first thing that we should do when we're talking about Pentecostals and autistics, I'm pretty sure at this point everyone knows what autistics are, but they might not know what Pentecostals are. Yeah, let's maybe start by explaining what is a Pentecostal and what does that even mean?
So when we talk about Pentecostalism, we can define it in a couple different ways, but one of the main ways that many Pentecostals identify themselves is as part of this tradition that begins with the Azusa Street revival in 1906 in Los Angeles. It's a prayer meeting begun by a Black preacher, William J. Seymour, that very quickly becomes this huge thing. There's like hundreds and thousands of people gathered in this corner of Los Angeles that there was pretty much no one in that area at the time. Eventually, people come from around the world to it. And it's marked by a couple of key features that continue into modern Pentecostalism today. One of the key features being ecstatic utterances, what we will call glossolalia or speaking in tongues, forms of enthusiastic worship, so people jumping, people dancing, people rolling on the ground, people screaming, people shouting, all those sorts of things. And then also forms of supernatural occurrences like supernatural healings, people laying on hands and testifying that they are being healed of diseases, that demons are being cast out, and the like. So that happens in 1906. Really, I think many people will say that Pentecostalism fits in this broader experience of religious enthusiasm that has always existed in some form or another in Christianity, although where it exists changes depending on the moment in Christian history. So we see samples of this kind of thing, say amidst the German mystics in the Middle Ages. People like Meister Eckhart would be an example. Later, we see this sort of thing with the Methodists in England. And in fact, this is one of the things that the Anglicans really hate about the Methodists, is that they'll have these big meetings and that people will be loud and they'll be boisterous. And even some of the things that John and Charles Wesley experience are not too distinct from some of the experiences of Pentecostalism, although Pentecostalism kind of expands on it. And then, of course, some of the early experiences of African American religion in the United States, both during the time of slavery and afterwards. And African American Pentecostalism will continue to be one of the major parts of Pentecostalism as it grows in the 20th century. Pretty early on, Pentecostalism splits on race lines. There ends up being essentially a black Pentecostal church, the Church of God in Christ, and a white Pentecostal church, which is the Church of God. Later, there's the Assemblies of God. And each of these denominations take their own view on how to translate and express the movement, while also trying to figure out how do you make an institution out of a revival movement? Like, how do you make sets of doctrine when you also have a form of religion that believes that you can have an experience with the Holy Spirit that will grant you a new word, right? A new message from God. How do you create kind of ecclesial structures when you have a movement that, at least at its founding in the Azusa Street Revival, is pretty egalitarian? And then, of course, very quickly afterwards stops being egalitarian, stops being racially integrated. And that kind of goes on for a good while in the 20th century. Maybe the weirdest thing about Pentecostalism is how it morphs. So I want to say around about the 60s, 70s, 80s, there's a big movement in the main Pentecostal denominations, especially the Assemblies of God, because they're larger and they're more well-known, and they tend to be located not just, say, in poorer communities like earlier Pentecostal churches were, where they begin making changes to accommodate for more of the popular forms of evangelical religion. So, for instance, one of the key touchstone theological points of early Pentecostalism is that there is a second baptism of the Holy Spirit that happens after salvation, after you're water baptized, and that this is shown through the gift of speaking in tongues. If you don't have speaking in tongues in early Pentecostalism, then you haven't received the second baptism, and you don't yet have that power from on high to be really called to the mission of saving people. And the Assemblies of God, one of the changes they'll make in the 60s, 70s, and 80s is that they'll begin to say, well, there might be other signs of the baptism of the Holy Spirit, and it probably can happen at water baptisms. We're essentially taking away from some of their distinctiveness to fit in with general evangelicals. Another thing they change, and I have a friend of mine who's done some research on this, is that they get away from their stance on pacifism, which early Pentecostals were all pacifists. And interestingly enough, 60s, 70s, 80s, suddenly Assemblies of God start walking back some of that. But then the other shift that happens on the flip side of this, becoming more like the evangelicals, is that forms of Pentecostalism start popping up in other denominations. And this is what we will call the charismatic movement. So there are Catholics, there are Lutherans, even Presbyterians, certainly Methodists, and also evangelicals, who will be having revival meetings, or they'll be having prayer meetings, and maybe someone from the Pentecostal movement will come to them, or maybe they will say that they've experienced the same things that people were experiencing in the Pentecostal movement, and they will see it as their vision to be the kind of local charismatic within those churches. This causes all sorts of conflict, especially in some of the more rigid and less open to, say, the idea of a supernatural gift of the Holy Spirit sort of churches. So in Presbyterianism and Lutheranism in particular, this is really controversial. And some of these people will just get kicked out. They just get kicked out of their churches, and they don't quite want to fit in the traditional Pentecostal world. And what happens is the beginning of a formation of what we often call neo-charismatic Christianity, but we just call colloquially, we still call this charismatic movement. Technically, it's a separate thing than that initial charismatic moment. And in neo-charismatic churches, they are churches that are founded by charismatics for the sake of creating a charismatic church. And these begin to look more and more like evangelical churches. And these become huge. And when I say huge, like massive in numbers and size, a lot of the mega churches, even the ones with more old school, traditional, say, Baptist televangelists, will start to take on more and more of the characteristics of these charismatic churches. Yeah, to the point that many charismatic churches, like most mega churches, are charismatic. Like, not all of them, but many of them are. And a lot of charismatic churches take on some of the features of those mega, which both makes them similar to evangelicalism, at least in liturgy, pared down liturgy and emphasis on song and then word, but makes them distinct from the evangelicals in that they still have this kind of core set of teachings about what does it mean to be filled with the Holy Spirit, what is the gift of speaking in tongues, what are the supernatural gifts more generally. I feel like that's a pretty good overview.
Yeah, no, I think you nailed that. I think you answered all of the questions that I could have asked as follow-ups.
Oh,
No, that's good. That's good. You anticipated the questions. So yeah, I think a lot of the key things you hammered on, if people are familiar with autism, their thoughts maybe the autism radars might start pinging at some of the things you were saying, because it sounds like in the Pentecostal church or within charismatic movements, there are a lot of things that would immediately push autistic people away based on some of the things you were saying. But at the same time, you could also see a lot of things that would maybe draw them in. And one of the things that maybe I'll get you to talk a little bit more about is the general vibe and culture of Pentecostal or charismatic movements, because that's something that I think people don't quite understand, because having talked to a lot of autistics who either are in or were once in the movement, they talk a lot about how one of the things they love so much is the people that tend to join this movement, and they're kind of weird. They're nonconformist. They have a lot of interesting personality quirks. So I mean, maybe I'll just let you take from there.
maybe probably my best way to do this would be painting a couple of pictures of some people I used to go to church with. I feel like that might be the best way. I'm thinking about one guy in particular. Let's call him George. This was in a neo-charismatic church. And when I say neo-charismatic church, this was not a mega church. This was a house church. So just to get a little bit of a sense of it, this was a home meeting that had outgrown the home of the lead pastor who was hosting it. He was hosting like a prayer meeting and Bible meeting, and they were doing song and worship at his house. He is 2 steps removed from the International House of Prayer, Kansas City, or IHOP. He was friends with Bob Jones, who was a part of that movement. And this man, out of his own money, bought a house on the edge of town, renovated it, transformed it into like kind of a little worship and prayer room, and began hosting a church there. And the goal was to institute at IHOP something like 24/7 prayer and worship. I was in charge of a midnight set there where I prayed from midnight to 2 my sophomore year of college. It was like 2 people at midnight to 2 making songs and praying. But just to get a picture of some of these people, so this man, this is not the pastor, this guy that I'm going to call George, he would walk up to you, his eyes like bug wide open, and then say things like in this kind of tone of absolute wonder. Sometimes he would say, "The other day I was working because he did construction, and I wasn't making enough money doing the work that I was doing. I asked the Lord to open up a new revenue stream, and the Lord said to me, 'You got to check the lines.'" And it got me thinking. And then I began doing a different thing. And he explained this whole thing where he was measuring the lines of the stuff he was working on differently. And it turned into a carpentry efficiency practice that he like saved time on, and thus he made more money with. And then he would just walk around the room as he was talking about it, like, "You got to watch the lines." And at other times during our worship services, um, he might do something like where his whole body would shake, or he'd raise up his hand and it would be like he was getting struck by lightning, or stuck into an electrical socket. So, both within a worship context in which there are these ecstatic experiences happening, that's one thing, but also outside of it, this is a guy that, like, you could tell from a mile away if you were like walking past him on the street, that guy's got a different view on the world than other people. And I think a lot of Pentecostal churches are stock full of these folks. And I don't see, to be clear, not these folks in like a derogatory way. It's part of what I loved about being in Pentecostalism is I love being around kind of fellow weirdos. We're all a little strange, and there wasn't really. It was almost like a hostile environment for people who were normal. Because if you were normal, well, then you were spending your Sunday nights watching the football game instead of going to church. And Pentecostalism doesn't want normal people. It wants people who say football ain't more important than than worshiping the Lord. Yeah, there lots of folks like my friend George there.
It also brings really intense people who
Yes.
have a way of seeing the world that's really appeals to a lot of autistic sensibilities. This is the way things are, and they either are this way or they're not. It's all or nothing thinking in a lot of cases.
Yeah, to talk on George a little bit more, there was a time where he came up to me very directly. He said, "I had a vision, and I saw that we will have powers in the last days that God hasn't unleashed on us yet. And the witches of Satan will fight us with their powers, but we'll be more powerful with our powers." And total earnesty on that kind of thing. And this is part of, for me personally, like where I'm trying to, in my own life, try to wrestle with which of this stuff feels real, which of this stuff doesn't feel real. That's one of those things that the witches fighting God's witches it feels like a very strong, no, that's definitely ridiculous. But then this man right in front of me really clearly believed it with all of his heart and with all earnesty. And maybe the one of the wilder things.
So one comment a lot of autistic people have often said is they liked a lot of charismatic movements or Pentecostal churches because for some of them it was one of the few places that they felt they could just be their own weird selves, and just they didn't feel like they were going to get judged. And a lot of times they said that they felt like they could just unmask there in a way that they couldn't in other places, because they knew I'm just with a bunch of other weird outliers, so I might be just no one's going to judge me for acting a little weird here.
Yeah, this also might be a little bit of why some people raised in Pentecostalism just quote unquote don't get it. I sometimes wonder if maybe they're the poor neurodivergent kids. No, sorry, the poor neurotypical kids, right? Who are like, oh, I'm not getting what this thing is. Maybe they're too normal for the rest of us. In my own experience, part of what I loved in Pentecostalism was the freedom that I felt while I was a part of it. I'm a cis male, and there are some expressions of emotion that aren't culturally typical for cis males in American high school culture, especially rural culture like where I'm from. And yeah, I would go into the Pentecostal church and I would cry, I would laugh, I would lay down at the altar and weep, I would dance, I would jump, sometimes I would twirl, sometimes I would spin. And even to this day, this is on the other side of the things I take seriously and things I don't. Like that, all that feels very sacred to me. all that feels very like it was something very important and crucial for me in my life and my understanding of who God is. Like God is the kind of God who receives the true person who's within us. Um, and Yeah, I mean, I definitely so there's certainly things about Pentecostalism that today I can't quite return to because it's so loud, and I'm a lot more sensitive now than I used to be. But then it was like this is a wall of sound, right? This is a wall of noise, and I can hide in that wall of noise and be myself, and everybody's doing their own thing, and because that's happening, there's no shame in doing your own thing. There's no kind of social pressure. In fact, if there is social pressure, there's kind of social pressure that why aren't you as weird as the rest of us? If you're just sitting down and doing your own thing, if you're quiet and silent, maybe there's something wrong with you, or maybe you're the normie who came in by accident.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you will see from the autistics that I've spoken to and from the autistics who I've collected data on, they will show up on both sides of those equations. They will show up as the awkward, quiet person that everyone looks at like, is something wrong with you? And they will show up as the person who finally feels that they can be free and able to express themselves in a way that they can't in other circumstances. And it's really interesting to see that autistic people are on both sides of them.
There's
One
also
of
like
the Go ahead.
there's also a social aspect to that too, in that when you're making friends, one of the hardest things about being autistic. Okay, this is my judgment. In my opinion, one of the things I find most frustrating about living my life on the spectrum is it's so hard to make a good connection with somebody. And friendship in general is an accident, right? It's almost always some sort of accident. But when you have hyperfixations and hyperfocuses, things that this is all I want to talk about, it's hard to find those other people that you can share that with, especially in a deep way, especially at the emotional levels. I've had friends in my life who we're friends because we both like video games, or I have friends in my life because we both like card games, but that never feels really at the heart of my being. And usually those friendships feel like they're not as deep as they could be. But my experience, especially when I went to college and I fell in with a group of charismatics, it was like, oh, these people see Jesus the way I see Jesus. And they understand Christianity be like more than those normies think Christianity is. And we're maybe not in a super special secret club, but we get each other in a way that other people don't get. And so I had these experiences of my college years where I can remember very clearly, I can date it, October 2009. And I've got it in my journals. There was this night where we had worship out at that house church, and about 10 of us were all gathered, 10 of us college age people, so 18, 19, 20, 22, 21, 22. And the adults left, the older adults left, and we just kept going, and we just kept going, and we kept praying, and we kept speaking in tongues, and we kept prophesying to one another. And then we eventually said, why don't we just take this to the town? And we went to Denny's, and then we started like praying over and prophesying for drunk people as they were stumbling into Denny's at 2 a.m. in the middle of the night, and like sharing messages about Jesus with the waiters and waitresses there while we helped the drunk people be less drunk and irritable with them. And we stayed there until 8 a.m. in the morning. It was just a totally different kind of experience of sociality. And it was very high. These are 10 people. I could, to this day, list off the names of the 10 people who were there with me that night. And these were people that suddenly we've shared something really special together. And we all have this kind of shared compunction about what Christianity looks like. And so there was like just a sharp and close bond forming in that, which I also think is not very typical in autistic sociality. It's hard to form those deep bonds. But this is, if we all share the most important thing, and that's where we get to the literalism thing. If we all share this highly particular, very atypical and strange interpretation of Christianity together, then of course we're best friends forever. Um, and it's always been interesting to me too, looking back, how sometimes even I meet other charismatics who are just not serious about it the way I was serious about it. And I'm like, man, you don't get it. But these 10 buddies of mine, they get it. Which of course is root cause of some of the superiority complex that Pentecostalism and the charismatic world sometimes brings to the rest of Christianity, which is not necessarily earned.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. One aspect that I often get asked about, mostly by Pentecostal or charismatic Christians who have now been diagnosed with autism, is they often have this idea that this denomination must be like teeming with autistic people. Like there must be a lot of us here. And one of the interesting things about the data collection is it is the from the data collection that I've done, it is the least represented group of people from all of those who I've been able to identify. And I'm wondering if you can guess why it's likely the least representative.
There's two reasons that come to my mind. Um, One has to do with the complication of making sample sizes of Pentecostals, and especially in the past 30 or 40 years, although this was happening beforehand. There's a lot of people who are charismatic but don't identify or brand themselves as charismatic, or who are in charismatic churches but don't necessarily realize that the things they're experiencing are charismatic specific. And so I've encountered people like in the evangelical world who say, "Man, my evangelical upbringing, they tried praying demons out of me. They were speaking in tongues. They were so evangelical." And I'm, "Oh, honey, what are you talking about? That's us. That's Pentecostalism. That's definitely not an evangelical distinctive." Now there are evangelicals with evangelical doctrine who still have some kind of continuationism, a belief in the continuance of the gifts of the Holy Spirit, but there are charismatic churches that just don't brand themselves that way. But then the second one is, this is a world in which kind of the foundations of truth are uprooted. And maybe the most important foundation of truth in some charismatic circles, and it depends on which kind. Sometimes they'll say it's got to be the Bible first. Some of them will say it's the Bible and the words of the prophets. And somewhere in between the Bible and the words of the prophets, there's a massive distrust in institutional knowledge, even in church institutional knowledge, and certainly in medical institutional knowledge or mental health institutional knowledge. So, for instance, depression would probably, I would suspect, would come up less often in charismatics if surveyed, at least up until recently, where I think that started getting more destigmatized, just because might be seen literally as a demon, right? That might just be perceived as a demon that with prayer and fasting, it can be gotten rid of. Um, and so it wouldn't be surprising to me that people just would not identify themselves as outside the norm. And of course, if you're surrounded by people who are outside the norm anyways, it's hard to know what the norm is. I remember taking the RADS-R test and going like, how the heck does someone get less than 90 on this thing? And then a buddy of mine took it and he got 23, and I'm like, like, how is that possible? Like, I just don't even understand that. And I think that same kind of cognitive dissonance happens when you're surrounded by people who are literally telling you that they're seeing angels. They cast out a demon the other day. They heard a word of the Lord. They've got a message for you. That's just a world that's normal. The real abnormal people are all these normies who don't hear from God. Like there's a kind of shifting of an epistemic framework, I think, in many ways.
Yeah, no, I think you hit the nail right on the head there. The Yeah, one of the biggest issues is just like self-identification as Pentecostal, like there or charismatic. Like there are people who go to churches that are called non-denominational, and I look them up and I'm like, oh yeah, that's a charismatic church. And they just say, oh yeah, I'm just like a non-denominational Christian. And yeah, again, the other big one is a lot of them don't believe autism exists, to put it just like bluntly. It's not to say none of them do, it's just a lot of the experiences that I'll get from people who get diagnosed with autism are only diagnosed after they leave Pentecostalism, because they don't realize that, or someone will try to like exorcise the demons, the autism demons from them. They don't know that they're autism demons at the time, but they're like, oh yeah, you feel down, you feel awkward, that's a demon, brother, and we're going to get rid of it. And so a lot of them just don't know that they're autistic. And the community has, like you said, a sort of aversion to a lot of the institutional ways of thinking about mental health and cognitive dispositions and things like that. And I think that's probably the best way to explain it. And then the next way to explain it is, I found a lot of autistic people going through charismatic or Pentecostal churches will feel a lot of cognitive dissonance from a whole bunch of different sources. One of the big ones, especially as they age, is sensory things. Like, typically services are loud. They go on for a really long time. They're like hyper stimulating. And for autistic people, that can just get real overwhelming real quick. Amy, who is the co-host of the main podcast, she was raised in one of those churches, and she talked about, as a child, like hiding under the benches and hiding under the seats because it was too loud and it was getting a little crazy and things like that. And so just the attending of churches can themselves be very difficult and cause a lot of issues. And then the final factor that I often hear a lot of is there. So in the podcast, when I talk about the ways that autistic people typically engage with their faith, one of the main ways is through like intellectualization, where autistic people are very intellectually involved in their faith, and it makes up a very key and core part of the way that they interact with Christianity. And I find a lot of the autistic people that I've talked to or read, they don't encounter the impulse of fostering that mode of being. I'll say, to put it lightly,
Yeah.
there's often a pretty strong sense of anti-intellectualism, I'll say, where it's like, you know, you like the kind of what I talked about at the very beginning of the podcast, like in episode 1, the head knowledge versus heart knowledge dichotomy, and how head knowledge is bad and you need to get away from that. You need to get down to the real heart knowledge. And so there are things like that that I think contribute to it.
I
But
mean,
overall,
even oh, sorry, go ahead.
yeah, I was just going to say, overall, I think that autistic people are represented within that denomination, probably to a similar degree that they are to others. It's just actually getting the hard data on that is a lot harder because of a lot of these unique quirks of the denomination itself.
Yeah, just to add to the kind of the intellectual, it is. This is probably one of the parts that I find most difficult and frustrating to me personally about this tradition that really forms like a core part of my identity. It's really anti-intellectual in a lot of the core culture of it. Maybe just as a little bit of like context for that, I want to say there are Pentecostal theologians active today, and there are some more, like I would say, important ones. But it's only been in the past 20 years that that's begun to develop to a place where it's theologically serious enough to be received by the broader theological community. So one person that comes to my mind is Amos Young, and he's Malaysian American. So he is coming from Pentecostalism from its global manifestation, and not not from necessarily its local one initially. So there is a sense that Pentecostal theology is more serious around the world than it is in America. So you go to Brazil and there are Pentecostal theologians, and you go to Asia and there's Pentecostal theologians. You go to Africa. There are Pentecostal theologians in America, but they're not received necessarily within their churches. Even the Assemblies of God, which is one of the more, I would say, institutional Pentecostal churches, the other one being probably Kojic, Church of God in Christ. Even there, it's not like you go up to a random Assemblies of God pastor and ask them, oh, did you read, in the case of Amos Young, did you read Amos Young's recent work on Pentecostal theology? And they're like, who? Who are you talking about? I mean, he's only like the most important Pentecostal theologian operating in America today. He's the guy who's making the case for Pentecostalism to the broader theological world. And this is certainly my experience in that I came to my faith in Pentecostalism, but that seriousness of faith told me that I needed to study it more seriously. And the more I studied Christianity, the more I got into the history of the church, the more I got into the theology of the church. I started thinking about church ecclesiology. Started thinking about church leadership and all these things. The less other Pentecostals and Charismatics wanted to do anything with me. The more they'd start going, "Oh no, you don't need that," or that's not important. That's not the way it is. And I guess from an autistic point of view, this is hyperfixation is scholarship and intellectualization and studying. This is the rabbit hole you'll go down. But that's not something that the other folks are interested in. And that in itself has been, at least for me, just a great frustration, because I think, and this gets to another piece that we haven't necessarily talked about too much, but when it comes to believing in the message that Pentecostalism is saying and the broader vision of what Christianity is, there's a sense that I really believe in it. I believe that God is active in our world today. I believe that God wants to work supernatural miracles in our world today, and that the church can be the agent for that. I'm deeply committed, even to this day, in that vision, even if there's some slight differences in framework from most Pentecostals or Charismatics. But I took that vision literally, right? And because I took it literally, I thought, surely this means I need to know more about this thing. And it keeps coming up that some people haven't gone down this line of thought process that I've gone down. And why haven't they? I think it's important for us to think about our theology. It's important for us to think about what a stable understanding of what the scriptures are and how they operate. Why wouldn't we want to know those things? And that dissonance, for me, ultimately became too much, because it didn't seem in line with what I was taught. It seemed out of line with it.
Yeah, so I think talking about how many autistic people are actually in charismatic movements is very hard. Like, the actual data gathering on it is very difficult. And the vast majority of people that I manage to catch with the way that I do data analysis is usually autistic people once they've left the movement. And so most of my estimates of percentages within the movement are based on their testimony of what they tell me about people who were still in the church. But I rarely talk to autistic people who are still actively Pentecostal and actively charismatic. That isn't for lack of trying. I have tried. It's just, for whatever reasons, it's very difficult to actually penetrate the communities. And so one of the ways that I try to explain this when I am talking about it is to say, okay, let's just acknowledge that the actual numbers for sampling bias reasons and for just aversion to diagnosis reasons are a little slippery. That being said, one of the things you can do is, instead of just looking at sampling data, is to look at push and pull factors, like things that would draw autistic people in and things that would push them away, to better understand what the state of autism in Pentecostal Christianity is like. So I think we can just start by talking about what sorts of things draw autistic people to Pentecostal communities. And I've got a few bullet points here that I've taken from various interviews with autistic people, mostly adult converts, or like late teens converts to Pentecostal Christianity, because if you're born in it, what do you like about it? There are still some things that you do like about it, but oftentimes you don't really have a choice. You're there because that's what your parents were. So talking to adult converts, there are a lot of things that draw autistic people to these communities. The biggest draw, and what you talked about in what you were saying, is very strong and vibrant communities that are non-judgmental and that fit a lot of the autistic ways of thinking about Christianity. And what I mean about that is autistic people can often be extremely intense. In the podcast, I talk about like the light switch effect, where they're fully on or fully off and like rarely in between. And charismatic communities can be very encouraging of that way of thinking about things and really into that sort of thing.
Yeah,
And
can
the
I give an
biggest,
example of that? Do you mind?
yeah, go
Because
for it, go for it.
I was just thinking about this one the other day. So I came into this Pentecostal church, and it was not a charismatic church. It was explicitly a Pentecostal church in high school. And at this moment in my life, probably the most important question on my mind as a 15-year-old boy was, who will I marry? um, which sounds very stereotypical almost, especially for an evangelical or a charismatic or Pentecostal young person, and the kind of sexual ethics of being in high school. But I remember very distinctly late in my senior year, I was trying to learn how to do what the other Pentecostals were doing, which is learn how to listen to the voice of the Holy Spirit. And at some point in one of these prayers, I just got the vibe and the feeling that I was supposed to marry this certain girl who was in our youth group. And so I called up my pastor. Now, in a very typical old school Pentecostal way, there was the husband pastor and there was the wife pastor, and they were both pastors. They both had shared authority. And I always talked with the wife of the two because she was this older lady. She was full of wisdom. She had lots of experience, and she was just very good at this sort of thing. So I met up with her. I sat in her parlor and just shared, this is what I think. And right now, in 2024, I'm looking back on it. I'm like, what you do in this pastoral situation, what you should do, is you should say, I think that you have a lot to learn when it comes to discerning the voice of the Holy Spirit, son. Don't go bother that woman at all, that girl, because we're all teenagers, right? What she did say to me instead was, yeah, I knew it. Me too. And bid on it. You have to be like Mary and ponder these things in your heart. Because of course I was about to go to college and she was a little younger, so she would have been still in high school while I was in college. And that's what she said to me. And I'm looking back on this going, what kind of epistemic framework was I in? But to the intensity point, right? That was like 100% what I'm believing, what I'm experiencing is not only true, it's getting validated by these authority figures who have the same intensity in a culture and context that has the same intensity. And that was looking back on it, it's, man, what the right response is to lower the intensity on that circumstance. I've been a Christian minister before. Anybody walks into my office and says that kind of thing to me, I'm going to say, hold your horses, bud. Have you had a conversation with her yet? Because I haven't, right? But that's the kind of world we were living in. Or I'm thinking about a friend of mine. Let's call him Ron. I used to live with this guy. And this was when I was part of that movement that was connected to the Charismatic House Church. And there was a revival happening at the International House of Prayer. And all day long, he had no job at the time. And all day long, he would sit in front of the computer with the live stream to this revival and be like rocking and crying and praying and sitting in the living room. And that was all he was doing every day, constantly. And I'd leave him in the morning. That's what he was doing. I go to school. I come back. He's doing the same thing. And that's the kind of people I was with. And at that moment, I was like, Ron really knows what he's doing. Ron, he's older than me. He's been in this longer. He's got a real heart for God. And this isn't to take away from the sincerity of his experience, because I think that's true. I think the sincerity is there. And I think that's part of the hardest thing in thinking about all this when one leaves this kind of movement, is that the sincerity that we had was real. But this was also a guy who was in a really serious socioeconomic bind. He was running out of money. His business had failed and was in the process of failing. He had no idea what he was going to do next for his like employment. He was at the time in his like late 30s, early 40s. Um, and this was the thing that he was dedicating all of his intensity to. It was all or nothing. And that's probably been the hardest thing for me personally to try to work out of, is realizing where I created structures of intensity in my own life.
Yeah, and I think a lot of autistic people, they crave that. They crave that certainty, that
Mhm.
intensity, and that idea of this is what we're going to do and let's commit to it. There's a documentary series about an autistic comedy troupe called Asperger's R Us. And in that documentary, one of the guys says, "You never see an autistic person jogging. They're either walking or sprinting. There's no in between. There's no reason you would ever do anything other than those two things." And charismatics are always sprinting. There's a lot of sprinting, and there's a lot of encouraging people to sprint. And so that sort of high intensity, high stakes, this is very important. And the validation of the way that autistic people want to see the world is very much there. And that another thing is, this isn't to sound like condescending to Pentecostal or charismatic theology, but it's often quite simple. It's often very do A, get B. And
Well, I
if
think it's
you
purposefully so. Like it's not necessarily transactional. There are some variants that I think get more transactional, but it is straight, cut and dry, straightforward theology. It's practical living theology. And that's part of what I think makes it such a compelling message, right? If you are in this thing, you will experience the glory of God. That's all you need to do. Just raise your hands and worship, and let God take control. And a lot of the practical theology does come down to a let go and let God, like put God in the driver's seat of your life of theology, but at an intense level. So when an evangelical says let go and let God, they are planning for their retirement. They're investing in a 401k. If I'm quite honest, part of why my 401k sucks right now at age 33 is because I was still very intensely Pentecostal until 2 or 3 years ago about money. I still had this view that maybe making money wasn't good for you, and that it's actually a spiritually dangerous thing to pursue money. And so I kept choosing opportunities that underpaid me, or opportunities where like we would just get by on whatever we could, and essentially bankrupt my family, or put us on a road for bankruptcy. Um, Without thinking anything about the future, because that's what a Christian does. Christians shouldn't be thinking about financial planning, right? Christians shouldn't be thinking about putting away for their children's college. Christians shouldn't be thinking about making enough money that they could, like, in case of an emergency. Instead, we should be like leaning into the supernatural provision of God. And now I say this, like I was very judgmental. Sorry, I say this, I was very all in on this for a while, and I'm frustrated that I made those choices, or that I was so all in that time. And yet, also, my experience over the past decade of life, it has been consistently, God does really provide those moments of crisis. And so that's actually, I think, part of the other difficult thing is that theologically, at least I would say, that God really does help us. Like God really does intercede in people's lives in real ways. And I think probably the hardest thing about Pentecostalism for me to kind of disambiguate is God is helping all sorts of people all the time. It's just that in Pentecostalism, we think that the kind of really highly rigid or particular lifestyles that we're living is why God is speaking to us, or why God is helping us, or God's interceding in my moment of poverty, it's because I'm really living the true poverty spirit and embracing like the call to a fasted lifestyle is what the charismatics would say. No, God's helping me in my moment of poverty because God loves me, God cares for me, and this is a moment where, for whatever reason, God has decided to help me. and God would do that for anybody else who's not doing it on purpose, or could do that for anybody else who's not doing it on purpose. But it's almost like the supernatural, the real supernatural instances in Christian life get thrown into the meaning-making structure of Pentecostal charismaticism. And I think that's extremely difficult to disambiguate. I'm finding it very hard.
Yeah, and like very common experience from a lot of autistics from these spaces that I find is dealing with that. But when you're first looking into it, that way of thinking, and when you're in it, that way of thinking is very appealing. And it's often very appealing to autistic people just because of the way that we tend to think about things. We tend to over moralize and like hyper moralize and have these very strong senses of the ideal and what should be, and if you do this you get this, and a lot of, or if you're a good person, good things will happen to you, and things like that. And a lot of that thinking really appeals to autistic people. And another factor is charismatics tend to have a very straightforward literalist hermeneutic when it comes to the scriptures, and so do a lot of autistic people. Like a lot of autistic people are like, you know, well, we believe this thing because it was written in the Bible, and especially younger ones. And the literalistic, charismatic, straightforward approach of being like, is this a metaphor? Hell no. This is like literally the exact thing. And so the heuristic
Well,
and
not just
interpretive framework.
it's not just a literal interpretation, but it's also there is a expectation that you should live in and abide in that Bible, right? The prophet Ezekiel has these visions, and they're really trippy visions. And so even it's not even so much these are visions Ezekiel had about real future events that are actually coming into fold and taking out the whole broader interpretive context of the prophetic tradition. But also this is a pattern. And so there were moments in my life where I can really remember I was like, this is my season where I'm like David and I am with the sheep and I am not fulfilling my purpose yet, but I am training for when the giant will come. That's who I am right now. And there tends to be a kind of identification there. And this is actually what you sometimes hear from the charismatics who get on the national scene, who might get involved in politics in some way, where they start talking about this person's a David figure, this person's a Nathan figure, this person's there's a kind of identification there. For charismatics and Pentecostals, that's like a history repeats itself in the patterns that you see in the Bible, and people live within those characters. Those are identity markers, and expectations for what can be possible for you.
Yeah. No, that, yeah, I think that's a really good example of the way of thinking where it's not abstract, it's not very metaphorical, or when it is metaphorical, it's very metaphorical in a very straightforward sense, where you give a metaphor and then you can look at your own life and you can exactly slot yourself into that metaphor.
That's right.
And that's a way of thinking that really appeals to autistic people.
I guess one way to put it would be is that it's allegorical. I think that's the reading here is, and this goes to that simplicity thing, right? It's a one for one, and that one for one is our life to the Bible to our life. So there's no kind of translation into the modern hermeneutic. There's only ever direct interposition and overlapping. So as actually as an example with the International House of Prayer, since that's the part of the charismatic movement I was most familiar with, the model of 24/7 prayer comes from a very specific reading of a line in the book of Revelation regarding the prayers of the saints and how they are holding harps and bowls. And so if you've ever watched a service at IHOP, of course you can't because they've closed because of the scandal that just emerged a year ago. But if you ever watched one of those, the older videos, you'll see that they'll be singing a song It'll just be a normal worship song, and then a guy will come up and he'll start praying. He'll start praying in an intensive way, and then the musicians will start singing the words back to him. That's what the founder of IHOP understood as harp and bowl. You're doing music, you're doing prayer, you're doing them together. That's a direct. I think that we should apply this section of the Book of Revelation to a pattern for this organization. It's a direct thing.
Yeah, no, that's a really good example. A final point that I get a lot of is in charismatic and Pentecostal churches, there tends to be a sort of I you'll probably have better words for this, but like a sort of egalitarian, non-hierarchical way of thinking about things where there are structures and there are like elders and there are people who have more authority and people with spiritual authority and things like that. But there's also often like a sense of, if you go to a classical like Western church like the Catholics or the Orthodox, there's a very clear, explicit hierarchy. And if you are in the pews, you are not doing anything else, right? Like you're not part of the ecclesial structure. You aren't preaching. You aren't teaching. You are basically there as a member. Whereas in a lot of Pentecostal and charismatic churches, there's the hierarchies can often be quite fluid, and there can be a lot of sort of a true sense of egalitarian vibes. Maybe
Yeah,
you'll probably be able to explain this better than me.
no, I 100% get what you're saying, and it's so interesting because I would say, in spite of the kind of the historical end, the early Pentecostal churches were episcopally structured like the Methodists, so not like the Catholics, not like the Episcopalians, but like the Methodists, where the bishop is a figure, but they're less important because they don't have a sacramental role like they do in Episcopalianism or Anglicanism or Catholicism and whatnot. And that is true actually to this day, in which the Assemblies of God, Church of God in Christ, they have bishop structures or centralized leadership in that sense. But they tend to be, each church is still more on its own than in a traditional Episcopal structure. And then each church in a traditional Pentecostal church tends to have a group of elders, and the pastor might be the first amongst many elders, or the pastor might be the person who calls the elders. But one of the things that often evolves ecclesiologically are forms of nepotism very quickly, especially in the non-institutional ones, in the charismatic churches, in which you have a founding pastor, and when that founding pastor gets too old to continue doing the ministry, the best replacement is really the son. I've seen it happen a million times, and it almost never goes well. It's almost always a crisis, usually because the son is not prepared for leadership or doesn't have the same skills. So ecclesiologically, this is a structure that does have a kind of tendency, some sort of centralization. And yet, to your point, in the experience of it, there is a kind of flatness because there is no theology that the pastor, there tends not necessarily to be a theology of ordination. And there tends not to be a sense that the pastor or the elders are necessarily, by virtue of their office, more authoritative than you. And I've seen Pentecostal churches where the most authoritative person in the room is some 90-year-old woman in the corner. Actually, my wife's grandmother is one of these women. God bless her. She is that Pentecostal woman in the corner who, when she speaks, everyone listens, you know? And so actually it can also be egalitarian in a male-female sense. There are some women who don't have formal titles or theological training who are nevertheless very influential in Pentecostal and charismatic churches. And there's always a sense that at any given moment in a healthy church, now I want to clarify that this is in a healthy context, that the congregation could respond negatively to what the pastor is saying or bring a rebuke. And I have seen moments where, thinking of the Pentecostal church I was in when I was in my high school years, there were moments in which we would be in the middle of worship, things would be going well, and one of the old ladies from the back, she'd come up, she'd give a word, and everyone would start crying because the entire church was getting rebuked. And it wasn't coming from the pastors, and it wasn't coming from the worship team. It was coming from maybe an elder, or maybe it was coming from someone who doesn't have a formal role, nevertheless someone who had this kind of spiritual weight and authority. And from that, a lot of people get a little bit of a boldness, where when I was in college, I was definitely the person who, if I went to a charismatic church that wasn't my usual church, I tended to actually come in skeptical. Okay, what do these guys have to offer? Is it the right thing? Is it the real thing? Is it the legit thing? And if something felt off, or especially if something felt off to me and something felt off to my friends, we would tell somebody about it. We would go right up to them and we would rebuke them to their face, as it were. And I mentioned George earlier, but I remember him telling me a story one time of a revival that was being led by a white pastor. And there was a group from a black Pentecostal church in the corner. And everybody, all the white worshipers were like really into it and raising their hands. But George was like, something's not right here. And all the African American Pentecostals were like, something's not right here. And they're just sitting down. And then one of them came up and prophesied to the minister, you're having an affair with someone, and pulled out his dirty laundry, as it were, and rebuked the whole crowd because they weren't getting what the Spirit was saying. And that's an attitude that all of us Pentecostals and Charismatics have. And to speak to the autistic sense, man, it feels nice to be the right person and to rebuke people for being wrong. That fits very nicely with how I manifest as an autistic person in the world. I still do this to my boss.
Yep. Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, so those are all of the examples that I've come up with from talking to these people. Are there any other draw factors for autistic people that you think we might have missed?
I think we mentioned this earlier, but it's worth underscoring that Pentecostal worship is similar to what stimming is.
Oh, yeah.
That there's something about the freedom of shaking your body in a variety of ways that is very freeing. And I see this, the vision that's kind of sometimes expressed in Pentecostal context is that this is like becoming like a child, in the ways that children are pretty free with their bodies. They move in weird and funky ways. But that's how I move my body when I'm stimming. And when I'd be in worship, it was the same thing, or it was a similar motion. It was a similar expression. And actually, I think that's sometimes I think to the cognitive dissonance that sometimes autistics feel in those places is that it is great to stim as an autist. It doesn't always feel great to be around people stimming. My son has a lot of similar characteristics to me. And when he's stimming, I'm like, you should do that, but do it over there. I'm not, that's not, it feels weird. It feels uncomfortable to me. It makes me feel itchy in my skin. And so if you're lost in the moment and you're worshiping God and you're in your own place, that's fine. But if you're not, and everyone around you is like doing, that's going to freak you out. So I think that's both a positive and a negative in that very classic autistic, oh, I really love autists, oh, I really can't stand autists kind of way. Like the way we're drawn to each other because we recognize that there's some kind of thing that we have in common. And then sometimes we're repelled by each other because there's incompatibilities of hyperfixation, or incompatibilities like your autism is too crazy for my autism and my autism is too crazy for your autism. But I think there's a kind of way that all that happens in Pentecostal worship all at the same time.
Yeah, no, for sure. I have a whole thing about different types of autistic compatibility and incompatibility. One of my friends recently, he met this woman that I work with who's very clearly on the autism spectrum. And he's like, wow, we should introduce her to this guy we know that's on the autism spectrum. And I was like, no, this you don't understand. They have the exact same type of autism. This will make a terrible couple.
That's right.
It's just believe me when I say this won't work.
It's important you mix the types of autism.
Yeah, you got to have different and complementing styles of autism for it to work.
It's very
Yeah,
important because it's important that my forms of executive function and your forms of executive function don't cause people to, like, I don't know, miss a bill.
yes, yeah, exactly. So yeah, those are a lot of the things that draw people to, or draw autistic people to these types of churches. And when I've talked to them, the biggest draw that I found is a lot of times people are like, I wanted friends, and this was a place that gave me friends. In general, that is what draws most autistic people to Christian communities. If you look at adult converts, the vast majority of them who are converting to Christianity with no prior experience of Christianity, or maybe a cultural Christianity, convert because this seems like a good place to make friends. And that is often why people are drawn to it. However, as I've said, I think a few times already, not most people that I talk to are people who have left these spaces. And I think it would be irresponsible to not also talk about those kind of push factors. So there's the pull factors that draw them in, but the push factors that push them away. In the podcast, I gave this kind of general overview model of autistic deconversion and what it looks like. And the model is this kind of cognitive dissonance pressure cooker where everyone has a certain level of cognitive dissonance. The things that cause autistic people cognitive dissonance are usually much stronger than their neurotypical counterparts. They have much more opportunities for cognitive dissonance, and their capacity for cognitive dissonance is also often lower. And so, what basically happens is enough of these things pile up to create cognitive dissonance that the pressure cooker kind of explodes, and then they have to pick up the pieces and do something with it. And yeah, we talked about the pull factors, and what really how this model works is if you have enough pull factors that keep you in that aren't outweighing the push factors, you'll generally speaking stay in. But as soon as those push factors start to outweigh the pull factors, you'll probably leave. And so when I talk to people, I ask them about their experiences, and they will often talk about these kind of push factors. One of the biggest ones is something we already talked about, which is that a lot of Pentecostal and charismatic spaces can be very high control and very high demand. And so they place a lot of expectations on you, on what you do, on how you act. And if you aren't meeting that standard, there can often be a lot of negative social consequences that aren't necessarily good. I'll say that. So, to give an example, I interviewed someone named DL Mayfield, and they were raised as a charismatic. And the things that they talk about are just harrowing. they they were raised to think the end of the world was coming and that they would play some sort of central role in the end of the world, and so their job was to conform and comport themselves to this specific way of religious life that would prepare them for their role in this coming tribulation that was going to happen. You get a lot of demands placed on you, and you're told this is the most important thing. So, a lot of what you were talking about earlier about thinking that you had to adopt a sort of like Christian poverty in order to act upon and correctly act on your faith. Sometimes these things are self-imposed, but a lot of the times these things are also imposed on you by your church or by your
Although
social community.
I want to say, though, on the high demand, high control, is when these things are being demanded in an explicit sense, it is certainly a push, right? So my wife was part of a neo-charismatic church, which was affiliated with what we call the New Apostolic Reformation, which is a specific form of neo-charismatic Christian nationalism. And in that church, there was explicit and implicit forms of control throughout it, where both the pastor's parents the elders, and a variety of other people were all in the system of ensuring that everyone played the game in the right way. And that was extremely traumatizing for her. But on the flip side of it, to speak to a different end of this, I think that there are places where those kinds of expectations aren't necessarily pushes and can become pulls for certain kinds of autistics, because they become essentially, rather than you having to come up with a system of morality for you to follow, you have one. You have a list. And in that context, it was really stressful for my wife, who's also autistic, because there were all these unexpressed boundaries, right? Like, where do you follow this rule and where do you not? That was like super stressful. And it was because it was a lot of social control. Whereas I've been in contexts where the moral rules were pretty clear cut and there weren't necessarily social rules or social control. And I was flourishing in those places because my list of rules was very easy to follow. And it was something that was very straightforward to embrace. So I think that's actually one of the hard things about this, is that there are forms of this that are lists of rules, and it's freeing for an autistic person. And then there are forms of this that are lists of rules that are absolutely exhausting, and then eventually to the level of cult control or brainwashing or social control in really insidious and spiritually abusive ways. But this is actually one of the ones on this list that I was thinking about, and I was like, oh, I actually think there's certain autists who love this.
There,
This is
there, there definitely is, and I think a lot of autistic people can be susceptible to joining cults, or susceptible to being preyed on by people who are starting cults and things like that, because there's a lot of autistic people often have very high level of trust and have a you tell them this is the most important thing and they'll say let's do this.
most important thing.
Yeah. And so there's often that sort of there's a demand to give it your all, and then you give it your all. And oftentimes this can, like you said, function as a pull factor, but it can also start to eat at you, especially when you look around and that other people aren't giving it their all like you're giving it your all.
Yes,
And
yes. Oh,
that can
oh,
like eat at your
oh.
spirit, where you're like, I am sacrificing so much for this. I am giving so much for this, and you people aren't doing nearly enough. Or
Yes, yes. I'm going to embrace spiritual
yes,
poverty. I don't think you're quite figuring this out, because your house is $500,000. Like, what's going on? And actually, this is a huge thing, because um, speaking of my wife's church, I look at those people and the lives and how they got to where they were. And so one of the big forms, or maybe I should take a step back. One of the big forms of social control at my wife's church, and this was before we got married, was that they required all the young people in the church to do essentially courting rather than dating. So when I first met my wife, this is showing how charismatic my life is. When I first met my wife, she required that I couldn't start a relationship with her unless I was confident I wanted to try to marry her, and that we had to go through this courtship process with her church, because she was still kind of inside of it. And I was part of helping her kind of realize there are other forms of charismatic Christianity than this, and something's wrong with these people. But now that we're on the flip side of that community, and what is the difference between courting and dating? I'm not really sure. But now that we're on the flip side of that community and looking back on it, this is a community of people who definitely dated, definitely in the 60s and 70s. Some of them probably dated many people, and they have fine marriages, or maybe they don't have fine marriages. But the structure that they were offering to the young people in their church was one that they themselves did not live. When I was embracing this concept of spiritual poverty, I remember very clearly, like a charismatic pastor telling me that I was embracing a call from God to like just live on what I received rather than try to make money and that kind of thing. And that he thought that was the right thing to do. And again, he had a $500,000 house and was definitely making it work in his own life, like explicitly encouraging an impressionable young person to not make the financial decisions he himself has made that put him in a place of stability that he could purchase his other building. So there's that's a huge cognitive dissonance. And uh, I, I keep bringing up the IHOP scandal, but I think that this is actually such a great example of this for charismatics. The people who lived as full-time missionaries at the International House of Prayer were people who were fully sold on this concept of spiritual poverty in a sense. Some of them didn't have any income at all for like decade or more. And what they did was they were serving as what was called by the organization intercessory missionaries. So they would raise support, but they would never quite raise enough support. And they get a little stipend from the organization, and then they would rent apartments from the organization, from buildings the organization managed, and apparently didn't manage very well because the apartments were run down and there were like 10 people in a 2-bedroom apartment. There was a food pantry filled with moldy food to feed the intercessory missionaries. And meanwhile, like the leaders of it, like the Mike Bickles and whatnot, they were doing a lot better off financially. They were selling books. They were going around the country doing conferences and getting honorariums. They were going on retreats and doing all these fancy things. And so even though someone like Mike Bickle, who was the leader of the International House of Prayer, would drive this crappy car and pretend to live at this crappy rundown duplex, it wasn't true. And I think for a lot of the people who were in that, once they started seeing that part of it, that was a breaking point. Why am I starving while you're being fed if we're on the same mission and on the same level on this mission? That doesn't make sense. And actually, I do know, not to advertise a podcast in the middle of a podcast, I know that there are some former musicians from the International House of Prayer who are right now working on kind of a podcast of their own stories and gathering these stories. So not just about the abuse, but about what was this thing that they were part of. And I think if you start looking at it through a lens of like, how many of these people are autistic?
More than one. I can tell you that for sure. I know it's more than one.
More than one. As the goalie dwarfs from Dragonlance count, two. No more than two.
Yes. And yeah, so like this, unfortunately, is I've found a fairly common thing that will happen with a lot of autistic people in these places is they get their marching orders and they're told, you need to take this seriously. And so they take it seriously. And then the people who are leading them don't take it seriously. And that leads to a sort of, wait, what's going on here? And oftentimes I talk to autistic people who come from these spaces and they have this like very well justified like betrayal trauma. I don't know if that's the right word for it, but they feel like so betrayal trauma is a specific term. I know it because of my time in the military, and it was like a specific thing that we would talk about. Soldiers feeling is when they were like sent out on a mission and they were sent out either ill-equipped or their leadership knew intelligence that wasn't passed on to them, and so they went out and just got their faces kicked in basically, and the ones survived came back and felt this very deep sense of betrayal that something had gone wrong. And like this is something that I dealt with when I was leaving the military. Is so basically for I guess 7 years of my life doing operations, it was just like balls to the wall, max effort, constantly going, never stopping. I worked every day, every evening, every weekend. Like you can ask my wife. She was like, "What are you doing?" All the time in order to facilitate operations, and then realizing at a certain point that a lot of the other senior officers there were mostly just like there to check boxes or get in a position so they could get a
Mm-hmm.
promotion. And I'm there being like, you told me I had a mission and I fully committed to this. And I'm about to join the Heart Attack Under 30 club because of the
Mm-hmm.
amount of physical stress that you're putting me under. But I'm doing this because I thought this was right. And it's really weird for me going from like military operations and feeling these feelings and then talking to guys who were like musicians at IHOP and being like, "Oh, I know exactly what you're feeling because you are feeling the same thing that like you are feeling a sort of near PTSD experience that I have felt being in the military under military operations for this sort of long continuous constantly strenuous time." And it's not just IHOP, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. No, no,
It's
no, it's
a
a lot
lot of
more.
churches. Like this is a feature that's sort of endemic in charismatic movements. Is this extreme demand that an autistic person will meet to rise, and then the reality that the other people in it don't care as much as them and aren't going as hard as them or aren't trying as hard as them hits them like a sack of bricks. Another very common one is that I've heard a lot of that's in this same vein is there'll be a group of people. I'll talk to the autistic person afterwards, but what happens is during this time of in the group of like worship leaders or missionaries, one of them comes out as gay to another person in the group, or they'll come out as somewhere on the LGBTQ spectrum, and the group embraces this person and is like, "We're here for you, we're going to support you, we care a lot about you." And then leadership basically torches them and torches their career, and the autistic person is either the person experiencing this, which obviously will cause a lot of cognitive dissonance, but a lot of times the autistic person watches this happen to their friend, where their friend that they care about, that they've been praying with, that they've been soldiering with through these, quite frankly, abhorrent conditions in many cases. And they think that the correct answer is for us to come together to support this person
Right.
and to care for this person. And often
I love my friend. I want to support them. I want to help them. Yeah.
they're not doing it in an affirming way in which they're
Mm-hmm.
saying, "We're going to help you live as a gay man now." They're like, "We are going to help you live a celibate lifestyle full of love and grace." And so they're fully side B in
Mm-hmm.
their original affirming
Because that feels
message.
if you're a conservative when it comes to LGBTQ stuff, but you believe in what Jesus says about what he thinks about like grace and love and our community, then how could you not be side B? Like they're like, if you're not side B minimally, then what do you understand about Christianity? Maybe this is me just spouting off in my own thing. This is it makes no damn sense, you know?
And that's exactly what they think, right? That is exactly what's going through their mind is, of course, the right answer is for us as a community to come together and to love and support this guy, to include him in our families, and to really care about this guy. And then the message makes it up to more senior leadership, and they go, "You can't be on worship team anymore. You
Get out of
can't."
my church. Get
Yeah,
away from my children. I
yeah,
don't want you here.
yeah.
No, I've seen it too.
Yeah. And so they watch this and they just go, "What the hell was that? What
It
just
makes no
happened?"
sense.
Another really common version of this are sexual abuse and sexual assault
Mm-hmm.
scandals in these churches where autistic people are like, "Yep, we're doing great, everything is going well," and then a bombshell drops and it's like, "Actually, the guy who's been leading your church has been sexually assaulting the parishioners." And there are a few different ways that churches respond to this. some of the times when the churches all go, wow, this is crazy, how could this have happened, like we need to fully redress this. That's one thing, and I find a lot of autistic people in those cases can be like, okay, the heart of man is corrupt at its core, and pastors are no exceptions, they can fall for this. But that's often not what happens. What often happens is a sexual abuse cover up. And sexual abuse happening it's bad and it's one thing, but sexual abuse happening followed by the powers that be attempting to cover it up, to stifle dissent, to push people's voices down and make sure no one else hears about it, that goes like completely contrary to everything that autistic person thinks should be happening. And again, we have this like very strong sense of right and wrong, this very strong, morally principled sense of this is what should be done. And in our heads, the thing that should be done is obviously don't cover it up. But then they
Right.
did cover it up, and it's what's
Yeah.
happening.
And then in the case of folks like, in the case of the International House of Prayer, with a person like Mike Bickle, or there's some things coming out right now about Rick Joyner over at Morningstar. And of course, there's been all sorts of things about Bethel and a variety of people over at Bethel for a long time. Just in the past couple of years, it's like suddenly the flood waters are opening up and the charismatic church is coming under the microscope. And these people are different. I just want to mark these kinds of leaders are very different in how they label themselves and express themselves than, say, a Bill Hybels, than, say, a John MacArthur, or a, who's that guy at Mars Hill? Mark Driscoll, yeah. In that, those people, their theology is always, I'm a man. I'm just a guy. That's their baseline theology. It's very evangelical. But in the charismatic, yeah, I'm just a man, but I'm also a prophet or an apostle. And the message that I have from God is unique to me, and and has to be adhered to. So, I mean, in the case of someone like Mike Bickle, the message was, if we don't do this work of 24/7 prayer, then there won't be an end day revival for the church. When the bad guy, the antichrist, comes, or if we don't do this work, this is actually like the actual thing that God's calling God's people to, according to Mike Bickle, it is to do this mission, not all the other things. This is the most important mission. And when that guy is making prophetic words to women that they'll replace his wife, and yet also like calling his entire community to follow him in a certain way. Oh my gosh. But I want to hop back a moment. You said this word, betrayal trauma. To be honest, I've never heard that word before, and I'm struck by it. I'm almost a little tearing up about it, because that is such an accurate description of my experience. I can note. Um, I, I note three specific high level betrayal trauma moments that cut me off from that charismatic church from college. And they were one right after another. The first one was, I was going into campus ministry with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, which is not a charismatic organization, it's an evangelical one. And part of InterVarsity's model for its campus ministers is that you are a missionary, so you have to fundraise your whole support. I had a $52,000 budget to fundraise, and I didn't fully fundraise, so I lived off of $27,000 my first year. But that was cool because of poverty, right? Spiritual poverty. But anyhow, I remember distinctly, I called all my charismatic Pentecostal people. This was my community. And traditionally, when you go into that kind of ministry where you are raising financial support, making financial asks of people, you go around to your community to support. And I very quickly found out that Pentecostals and Charismatics don't support missionaries. At least they don't support missionaries in this way. They just were all balking at me. Every last one of them. Some of them were like, "What are you even doing? This makes no sense." Some of them were offended that I was joining up with a non-charismatic organization. And then I remember one specifically saying explicitly to me, I will not fund any ministry that is not explicitly talking about the gifts of the Holy Spirit. I'm like, but brother, you know me. I want to talk about the gifts of the Holy Spirit. That's who I am. You're not funding InterVarsity, you're funding me. So I had that moment of, oh, I thought I could go into this thing. This is going to be like my job for the next 2 years. And none of my community is supporting me. I ended up building my support team by going to a bunch of non-charismatic churches, a bunch of normal evangelical churches for support. Very strange. But then later, at the end of that summer, so I live in the St. Louis area, and that end of summer into the fall was when Michael Brown got shot, and the Ferguson riots were beginning, which I was like at a place theologically and spiritually and politically where it made perfect sense to me, right? Here's this teenager who just got killed by a police officer. um, I don't actually care about some of the details regarding it. This shouldn't have happened. This is wrong, right? Something's not right about this. And I felt really strongly, supernaturally convicted that God was angry about this, that this was something that we as the church needed to respond to. And so two things happened. One thing was I was waiting for the prophets to say something, and they never said anything, right? The Mike Bickles, the Rick Joyners, the charismatic leaders. This is a national event as it starts to take off. Everyone remembers the Ferguson uprising. Um, and none of the charismatic leaders said anything about it. That was like, what's going on? Is the Spirit not speaking to you? The Spirit spoke to me. I remember very distinctly having a moment where I felt the Spirit speak to me with the words of the prophet Isaiah, right? I won't forgive this people because there's blood on their hands. So that was the word I got about the Ferguson uprisings. And then, if you remember in those times, this is 10 years ago, one of the things that some of the protesters did was they would cut off the highway and make a human wall. And I remember one of the guys who went to, this would have been George, who I mentioned earlier's brother. I saw him make a post on Facebook with the protesters on the thing where he says, I hope someone runs them over. And this is a guy that I had seen preach, I'd seen him prophesy, I'd seen him pray, I'd seen him be part of the worship team. He was one of those people who was, as I perceived it, all in. So this isn't like some of the people in charismatic world where it's like, hey, you're not really spiritually all in. So I understand when you say something crazy, right? This is someone like I had determined was like, he was like one of the great guys. He's one of the best guys. And regarding these protesters, this wall of black and brown bodies, he's run them over. I'm like, who the hell are you? what are you doing? Like, why in the world would you say that? Like, how could you even conceive that is an appropriate thing to say? What in the world does that make sense? And that for me that's when I stopped being part of that church. That was the moment. I was like, I can't be part of this group if this is what they actually believe. And that's actually when I stopped being part of the Pentecostal and Charismatic world. I was still part of the conservative evangelical world for a couple more years after that, because I thought surely the craziness was just with the Pentecostals. I was mistaken on that end.
if it makes you feel any better, so I was like doing mass social media scraping at the time of the Ferguson riots of autistic responses to it, and you are not even close to the only one who had that exact same experience of going, wait, what? The autistic people were feeling clearly we should be on the side of the protesters. This is God's prophetic words speaking to us, or like, this is where we should be doing things. This is where we as a church need to be. And then having their church turn around and be like, either say things explicitly like, I hope they run them over, or saying things like, he was no angel, or we need to just stay out of this. This isn't a church thing. Or explicitly, we need to back the police. The police were right in this situation, and all these sorts of things. And the autistic people in there were like, wait, what?
The
Like
police backing
this?
thing is like a
Yeah.
huge cognitive dissonance for me, because I actually, at some point much later, I found out that my Pentecostal church that I was a part of in high school had done like parade route in support of the local police station, which by in that small town in the middle of nowhere in Illinois, there are like 2 police police station. And so that's even weirder, like doing a prayer parade for the police station when there's 2 or 3 guys. And like literally all they do is they give speeding tickets, really. An occasional meth bust in South Central Illinois. But that just is so strange to me because yeah, that is one of those things that is only explainable if somebody's listening to a whole lot of Rush Limbaugh, which George's brother was, or if they are taking specific conservative political talking points. Because, man, the New Testament's not very pro-police. I mean, it's very skeptical about those who are representatives of governmental authority and the weapons they have. I'm like, and Jesus gets arrested, and the early church gets arrested. The early church is criminals. They're all criminals in a real sense because they keep getting thrown in prison over and over again. And I just that is obviously, as I'm emoting on it, it is something that I'm like, I just this was before I understood that this was part of what came with the politics. And I guess this is something also to speak about with the push is when I came into it, the political aspect of Pentecostalism was not on my radar at all. I did not go into it perceiving conservatism. Now, I was surrounded by it. I can remember to this day when the pastor I was a part of in my youth was talking about the Jeremiah Wright "Goddamn America" speech in a negative light, and on occasion, like saying things that were clearly about Obama or clearly about Sarah Palin in a positive way, because Sarah Palin's a charismatic of some kind. But it all went over my head at the time because I didn't have a context for it. I was raised in a very Democrat household. So I don't know, maybe having a little bit of some conservatism was a youthful rebellion thing. But it just didn't process in that sense. But when the blinders came off and I started seeing, oh, this isn't like a theological thing, or this isn't a biblical thing. Like the conservative view on sexuality, okay, I see that in the Bible, right? I see where they get that in the Bible. The conservative support for free market capitalism and the conservative support for the police or even the military, that's where I'm like, oh, I don't know that we're tracking with what these things are. Like, why are you falling into this bucket? And why are these buckets continually falling into this bucket? I guess another betrayal moment was a moment. This is, oh my gosh, this is such a Pentecostal charismatic thing. Oh my gosh. I'm glad I'm getting all these stories onto your podcast. So I was a prayer leader for the house church, house of prayer church, the small house of church, prayer church. And on our Friday nights was our main prayer service. And this one Friday night near election night, 2012, yeah, it would be the 2012 election. I was, so that was Obama and Mitt Romney. I was the prayer leader that night. And so I was the guy who was speaking the prayers while the team would pray my prayers. And of course, on the agenda for the prayer list, as I'm going up there, and I have a little list of what are some topics we should pray for. Okay, we should pray for the state of Israel. That's another topic about the state of Israel stuff. We should pray for souls to be saved at my campus. We should be praying for revival, and we should pray for the election. Okay, so I've got this list of things, and I start praying for the election. And in my prayer is, Lord God, you have given these 2 men the opportunity to lead our country, Mitt Romney, Obama. We pray your wisdom, and that the one who has the greatest wisdom to lead us would lead us. You grant them grace and mercy. Because to me, there wasn't too much of a theological different distance between a Mitt Romney and Obama. And personally, I was kind of like, Obama's a Christian, Mitt Romney's a Mormon. I was kind of in my own little Christian nationalism stage where I was like, on those scales, Obama probably weighs a little heavier. And then the pastor who's on the guitar and singing starts singing for God's anointed man, Mitt Romney. And I'm over here on the prayer mic going, but we're praying for both people. We start going back and forth. And afterwards, I approach him and I say, not in this terminology, but essentially, what the heck are you doing, brother? You're saying that Mitt Romney is a man of God. He doesn't believe that Jesus is the Christ. He can't be a man of God. I'm realizing that this is a very autistic confrontation. He can't, he doesn't believe in the Jesus we believe in. He has a whole other book of the Bible, and he's part of what we would identify as a cult. You can't call him a man of God. He might have values you like, but we can't endorse that anyways. We're church. That's not what we do. He was like, but Obama was essentially the Antichrist. Not in so many words, but eventually that's what he was saying. And in a couple of weeks, he ended up preaching a message about the man of lawlessness and trying to tie that to Obama. And what is going on here? What is this thing I'm a part of? This is not what I signed up for. None of this is what I signed up for. I signed up for Jesus. I signed up for the Holy Spirit. I signed up for supernatural gifts. I signed up for prayer. I signed up for all these things, but I did not sign up for this thing where we're calling Mitt Romney a man of God because he aligns with us more politically than someone who is a baptized Christian. Yeah.
And so this effect that you were describing it got cranked up to not even 11, it got cranked up to 3,000 with the election of Donald Trump in 2016. And I just remember, so I was still like doing data scraping in 2016 and just seeing the amount of autistic people posting, what on earth is going on? This guy does not conform to Christian values, just like in the slightest. Why are we supporting him? And getting really confused about that. And especially in charismatic Christianity, a lot of it is tied to a sort of right-wing populism that is pretty enthusiastic about support for Donald Trump. And a lot of autistic people, especially autistic people who are given this sort of black and white way of thinking about what's right and what's wrong, look at Donald Trump and don't come away with a particularly good assessment of his character, I'll say. And they go, feel however you want. This is not the Lord's anointed. And they'll be like, there are many people who could be the Lord's anointed. He's not in the running. What's going on here? And that's
on the bottom 10 list.
Yeah, like he wouldn't even be considered for the last 10 people on Earth. He might be one of them, but there's a sense of, wait a second, what's going on here? Because what they think should be the logical progression of politics, which would be not supporting Donald Trump, they often say, I had in my head this difference. There's like a sort of begrudging support for him, and then there's enthusiastic support. There's begrudging support where you say, the other guy is worse, so we can't vote for him. And then there's enthusiastic support where you're like, not only is the other guy worse, this guy is the best. And it's this guy is the best effect that often drives them to think, wait, what am I doing here? I in this, like, the values that you gave me, the values that you imbued in me, and the values you're displaying are two completely different things. And that causes like a lot of, really just a lot of cognitive dissonance.
No, it's incredibly wild to me, and it continues to be, and part of my eventual shift from the charismatic and Pentecostal world to, say, a more, I would call it conservative or moderate evangelicalism, to progressive evangelicalism, was situated around 2016, and really just seeing that what I thought was just charismatics being confusing and strange and bizarre and odd actually had some kind of root in evangelicalism in the bigger picture, which was shocking to me because, of course, the evangelicals I was part of in college were InterVarsity, which is actually moderate progressive evangelicalism. So I was just like, I just didn't understand where some of this came from.
Yeah, and so like the one thing I found that in places where, so charismatic circles in the UK, for example,
Very
don't
different.
have the same issue. Very different. Most of what we're talking about with at least the political side of things is mostly a North America Canada phenomena, or
A
America
little
Canada
South
phenomena.
American, a little South American,
Yeah.
because the culture of Pentecostalism in South America and certain parts of Africa is very strongly culturally shaped by the U.S. Whereas Asian Pentecostalism is doing its own thing and has its own unique political situation, but certain parts of Africa and South America are in a symbiosis. In the International House of Prayer thing, it was the South American Charismatics who started up first saying, we're cutting off Mike Bickle and IHOP. We're done with this. This is no longer a thing we're going to do anything with.
Yeah. So I think we covered that aspect. Another aspect is are things that we've already talked about, but related is in charismatic circles, as you said, it isn't just that a person is a pastor, it's that there is a pastor and a prophet with specific words for you. And this can lead to the development of cults of personality centered around a guy. And what happens if that guy just doesn't like you? So, a common thing that I hear from quite a few autistics is they will either go into worship team, or they'll be doing an internship at a church, or they will become a assistant pastor or something like that, where they'll go into a junior clergy position, and they're a bit weird, they're a bit awkward, they may not have the best social skills because they're autistic, and the pastor or the senior pastor or the elders or someone in that just doesn't like them, and they have a sort of cult of personality around them. And so it isn't just that they interpersonally don't care for you, it's that God's anointed, who is a man speaking the words of God, has a personal feud with you. And this happens with a lot of autistic people just because sometimes we can be a little socially abrasive, I'll say. And especially if we think there's a problem, we'll just say it to the person's face. And a lot of times these communities create hug boxes around leadership where they're surrounded by yes men and they're not told no, and then an autistic person will come in and be like, this is wrong, we need to change that, and they take that really personally. um, and so a very common story that I get, especially from autistic people who go into these leadership positions, is there develops a cult of personality around the leader, and they don't join that cult of personality. And because they don't join that, they get immediately targeted and ostracized and then shot out at the earliest convenience. And yeah, that obviously fits into the kind of betrayal trauma side of things as well, but it's unique to those other aspects where it's a failure to go along with the social ideas or like the social norms of the community that have coalesced around a leader that autistic people just generally don't go along with anyway. And that the failure to conform in that sense leads to social ostracization and rejection. And it's often, again, a very painful thing for these autistic people because they often join because these are like the one place where they have friends and they have community, and then all of a sudden that community is rejecting them. And again, oftentimes in these churches, you don't just leave the church, you are like shunned by the church. Like you are kicked out, you are persona non grata, everyone blocks your number, no one contacts you, everyone unfriends you from Facebook, and you're gone. And
People stick
so yeah.
around on Facebook and then they drop nasty comments and you have to block them.
Yeah, yeah.
Also possible.
Yeah.
No, it's weird. My experience, I will say, this is not to discount all those kinds of like really strongly negative experience. I fortunately had not had that kind of shunning kind of experience personally, and I mark that up to being, at least in my Pentecostal church, was I think mostly a healthy community in spite of some of the quirks and strange things and things that I now view differently. But also part of it is that I willfully left those circles. But even willfully leaving them felt like a death because there is a gap between me and even the charismatics I continue to keep up with. I have a friend of mine who's always been very close to me. He was almost like a brother in college, and I had this weird conversation with him a couple of years ago, where it was like he was trying to probe whether I was a Christian or not, and I just couldn't figure out where that suspicion was coming from. It was like, why do you feel like that's an important question to ask me, man? Because I don't know. I'm speaking with you on Christian terms. I'm like literally doing a master's degree on religious studies, not because I'm like wanting to deconstruct religion at all, actually, because I'm trying to comprehend and understand it. But clearly he was also aware of the fact that I had distanced myself from some of the other people in our community and distanced myself from the churches that I was a part of previously. And so even without the shunning, so no shunning in this circumstance, nevertheless, still there was this kind of social weirdness that came in. And I had it too with another friend who was one of my groomsmen in my wedding that I hung out with a couple months ago. And we had this really wonderful conversation on all sorts of other things. And yeah, at one point there was this moment where it felt like he was trying to grill and figure out what my politics were because he sensed that they were different. And I was not interested in talking about that with him. And yet there was this kind of insistency of drilling into my sensibility. The topic we were talking about was like how churches should give to the poor. And he was like trying to lean into it. Are you a socialist, bro? Essentially. But in the most passive aggressive Midwestern way possible. And now that's someone that I'm like still on very good terms with. That's somebody that I'd love to invite him and his wife and his kids over to my house for a cookout. And we talked about that. And yet, even there, that rift was still felt socially as like I've crossed into some sort of other category. And people are trying to figure out what that category is because I've rejected certain things. And they haven't like even talked with me to know what those categories are. They just feel it and they're expressing it. And I don't know. It's very wild because I think part of the thing is that for the people who remain within it, it is still the entirety of their world. They don't have the ability to perceive meaning structures or epistemic structures outside of it. And so that weirdness that we felt when we were inside of it, that made us feel like we were part of this unique world, this world that's really important that we want to be part of. Like we really want to invest in this thing. Now we're outside of that and we're the normies. Which of course is a really horrible thing to feel as an autistic person. Suddenly realize, oh, all my weirdo friends think that I'm a normie now. Because for whatever reason, right? Because I don't think that we should embrace being poverty or think that Donald Trump is the chosen one or something like that.
Yes, or believing that certain people in certain countries should probably be bombed less than they're currently being bombed.
Oh, yeah. Well, we should lean into the Israel thing because the Pentecostal church that I was a part of growing up was, I think their number one thing was support of Israel, which is surprising. This rural South Central Illinois Pentecostal church has for the past 30 years sent a portion of their finances to Israel missions. 30 years. And some of it I know goes to Israeli resettlement, which is, of course, Israeli colonization projects. And yeah, this past year, for me, it's not just been the International House of Prayer thing, which is one of my forms of charismatic Pentecostal Christianity, but it's also been this Israel. So like my eyes opening and going, holy shit, they were wrong. And they were wrong in the most savage and horrific way humanly possible. And they still can't see that. That to me that's probably actually the place where I'm at my biggest end with Pentecostalism and the Pentecostal part of my life. because we attended a Messianic Seder, a Passover Seder with a Messianic Jewish congregation. And we were a Pentecostal church that instead of celebrating the Christian feast, celebrated Jewish feasts instead. They had a Friday night Torah study. So that was a big part of the culture of that Pentecostal church. And the events after October 7th have been the word you used, betrayal trauma for me in a very big way. Oh, I was wrong. We were wrong. They were wrong. And not just wrong, but like disastrously wrong.
But yeah, and so the other factors we've already touched on, so we don't have to go into too deep in them. But like the other factors that we talked about, autistic people are often very intellectually focused, and charismatics are often very much not, and often can be anti-intellectual and really discouraging of study and things like that. And this, you don't really need to do this. And you've already talked about that, so we won't go into it. That'll often push autistic people away, because I explained in one of the earlier episodes that the way that a lot of autistic people like genuinely engage with their faith is through intellectual study, and that's like the thing they really understand. And when they don't, or when they're not encouraged, or when they're told this isn't important, that can often push them away. Another big factor is a lot of autistic people simply don't have a lot of the ecstatic emotional experiences that are expected. That's not to say that autistic people don't have those experiences. I've met quite a few autistic people who have had a lot of the uh, ecstatic emotional experiences. I think you've said that you've had some of them, but some autistic people just won't have them, and they'll think something is deeply wrong with me. People will try to exorcise the spirit of doubt out of them or something like that, because they think what's preventing you from having this experience is really doubt. And so they try to have that, the congregation lays hands on them to drive that out of them, and they just feel nothing, and they aren't moved, and they don't know why they're not moved. And it's because they're just not emotionally processing in the same way. And some autistic people can do that emotional processing very intuitively. Some of us can't. And for those of us who can't, being told your salvation, whether or not you are saved, is dependent on these sort of ecstatic emotional experiences, when you're not getting them, can be this deeply traumatizing event. And especially when people figure the reason you can't do this is because you have a demon living inside of you, or because maybe you don't have a demon living inside of you, but you have a spirit of stubbornness that is preventing you from doing this, or you just aren't opening your heart up enough. And they're like, I'm trying my literal hardest. There's nothing more that I want than to experience this, and I'm just getting nothing. And I don't know what to do. And so that's also a fairly common feature. Again, a lot of autistic people in these circles will have those experiences, but a good portion of us will also not. And so when you do have those experiences, it's great. But when you don't have those experiences, that can be like a something that makes you seriously question what's actually going on here. And if you want examples of that, you can go to episode 6, where we cover all these experiences in probably more detail than most people are interested in. So yeah,
Autistic podcast for autists by autists.
yes. at the length and detail that autists would enjoy. Actually, I feel like I haven't even gone into even close to the amount of detail that I want to go into for most of these. But if people want to know more, I'll go into more. So there are some other aspects that I think are worth mentioning for people who leave the church. And yeah, like a big aspect that I found is that sense of betrayal, like that betrayal trauma that they're feeling after they leave the movement. It is a pretty big feature in most of the people that I talk to, because in these circles, you're encouraged to full commit. And so you do full commit. You throw your entire heart and soul at this problem, and then one day the rug gets pulled out from under you, and you're just like, what am I supposed to do? And Once an autistic person leaves the charismatic or Pentecostal circle they're in, some some of them cope well with it, some of them don't. So a lot of them will end up dealing with issues of substance abuse and things like that, because it's like the only way that they figure out how to cope with the like significant weight of the trauma that was given to them. They can often hop to other forms of extreme social groups. So they will go from charismatic churches to extreme far right political groups, and then jump to extreme far left political groups right after they left the far right one. And they'll basically just hop between these like high control, high demand groups. And usually when I talk to them, it's after they've hopped to a few of them and realized, oh, there's something deeply wrong that I haven't accounted for. And then they get diagnosed with autism and then they find me. But
I was
yeah,
wondering if you data scrape on DSA because
yeah.
I feel like my experience my experience when I've interacted with people who are DSA people, and my experience with people who are 100% part of what I think we would often call the alt right, is also that there's a lot of undiagnosed autism in those. Not all of it. There's certainly, for instance, amidst the alt, certainly some people who are full-throated fascists and racists. But then I'm thinking about a guy. I'm thinking about a couple of different men I know who it's clear that they have some kind of desire to create order in their sense of social and political morality. And they find themselves attracted to movements like the alt right because it gives them a sense of order. Now, that might be a general political reality. I mean, this might be like this might be beyond just autism, the sense to kind of order this. But the guys that I'm thinking about are all obviously Asperger, like to a T. Every single one of them fits that the kind of stereotypical manifestation of it. I think about how those kinds of movements like provide something in that sense. Yeah, I'd be curious. Maybe this is outside of your scope and sequence, but it seems like something that'd be interesting to analyze. But the other question in the back of my head, being a person who studies comparative religious studies, is how it applies to other religions too. Because that strikes me, there are some religions that do offer a greater system of stability than Christianity does. I'm thinking of Islam in particular, offers a very clear set of structured and organized norms that, yeah, it's very nice and tidy.
Yeah,
It
and
has a value for cleanliness.
that's
That's
something that I'm also very interested in. I was planning on doing a politics episode at some point, just autistic Christians and their autistic politics, and just all the very weird things that come out of that. But yeah, no, also very interested in the comparative religion problem, but I've sunk so many of my costs into only answering questions
yeah,
about
yeah, no.
Christianity.
It opens too many opens too many bags of worms. It opens to there's a lot of sticky questions in that. But you bringing all this up gets me thinking about it. I'm preparing to teach a comparative religions course in the spring, and one of the things I'm going to be doing a comparison on is um, comparative, like the ways. This is probably not for the podcast, but it's going to be a little bit of like how different religions transform or don't transform when they land in the United States. And in Islam's kind of modus operandi is to create little sites and locales of recreating the kind of Muslim culture that existed in the previous context. Whereas like Hinduism has to fully adapt in a different way because all of the gods of Hinduism are local. What do you do with your like bringing your shrine into the new place. And there are other translations and transformations that are different. And clear non-Western religion that has the kind of easiest impact in the United States is Buddhism. And it's really because it has that kind of universalism that it shares with Christianity and Islam. But that's
Yeah,
neither
it
hither nor
is.
thither. It's a different topic.
It's a very interesting topic that I would be really interested in knowing the answer to. And I feel like I've gathered quite a bit of data on those things just passively by doing what I'm doing. But I don't understand, like I can say at this point in my life, I understand Christianity. However, 10 years ago, I would have also said I understood Christianity, and I definitely didn't understand it 10 years ago. And I feel like I'm even farther behind on the curve for Islam and Buddhism. And so I think in order to do good research on like religion and autism, you have to have both a deep and complex understanding of autism and of the religion. And I feel like one of the biggest issues with most of what I've seen from autism and religion research is you either have one or the other and you don't have a lot of both. And so I'm mostly just I know I would fuck it up if I did it with Islam. But yeah, anyway, yeah,
No, there's just so many variables that make it much more
yeah,
complicated.
yeah. We'll cut this part out of the podcast. Yeah, back to charismatic and Pentecostal autistics. Like I said, one of the biggest things that I often have to, or that I often find, is most of the people that I'm talking to are trying to figure out a way to reconstruct their faith after leaving, or figuring out how to put the pieces back together. They usually figure out they're autistic, and then they run into me or I run into them, and I talk about that with them. And a really interesting thing that I found is many of them that do continue on in Christianity, they often don't fully leave their charismatic practices. Like they don't, it never leaves them, it just shifts. And so they often like stay pretty true to those same practices that they built and developed in their Pentecostal or charismatic circles, but they just, I guess they're less overt about them in their denomination, but it's still very much there. It's just maybe a little more dormant. And they often say, I just want to move on to something that's a little more intellectual. And many of them who move on, we've been talking to a lot of people who have been deeply traumatized by these faith practices. Some of them aren't, but usually if they decide to move to somewhere else in Christianity, the thing they look for is mostly something more intellectual. And a lot of them have this feeling that they've outgrown it to some extent. And it was like, this was an important part of my life in my early 20s. But now I'm ready to move on to something different now that I'm older, is often the thing that they deal with. And I find a lot of them still have a lot of the residual wrestling between the sort of head knowledge, heart knowledge dichotomy that I think is mostly just a false dichotomy. I don't think there's really an actual difference between emotional and intellectual processing. I think intellectual processing is emotional processing to an extent, especially for autistic people. And I don't think you can be either head or heart. I think they're just different blends of different continuing religious trends.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting thing to say because like this for me personally, I think this is part of why I feel like such a draw towards Episcopalianism, but like behind Episcopalianism, like behind say Anglo-Catholicism, something like Catholicism. At least I've gotten to a place personally where I feel a much greater respect and kinship with Catholicism, mainly because in Catholicism, I see a greater order in which all the supernatural stuff that I don't disavow still fits. So even though I'm not doing RCIA, I'm not crossing the Tiber or anything like that, I'm still too Protestant in my theology in many ways. But I keep trying to understand myself within this broader scope of the church and church history. And there are many things that in my own spiritual experience that are weird, or things that are unexplainable, or things that don't fit to the whole earlier thing about embracing a fasted lifestyle and living in poverty. I really have been down to my last buck maybe too many times than I should admit, and yet never been without. Like I've hit that spot too many times, and I've always gotten some random, like sometimes random strangers writing checks for me or handing me cash. When a settlement comes in and you get $100 extra because Instagram stole your data or something like that. It always happens right about when I'm about to hit zero earlier in my life when I wasn't thinking about my finances in a responsible way. Or speaking in tongues, it's not something that I've given up on, right? It's still part of my spiritual practice at times. It's less now than it used to be. Or even like the gift of prophecy or the gift of visions. My wife and I have made decisions in our lives based on what we discerned was a word from God, even after we were far away from the Pentecostal and Charismatic movements. But those things make a lot more sense to me if I have some kind of, at the very minimum, like a lowercase c Catholic understanding of the church. Like we are part of this big universal thing. And there's this concept in Catholic theology that I love that I think Protestants would do well to pick up on, which is the idea that it's not that the church is where you find God. It's the church is where, when you find God, it's God. But that's very different than saying the church is the place where you find God, right? The church is where the sacraments are organized and regulated, and you can go, I know for sure when the priest prays the prayer, that Eucharist is going to be Jesus. I know for sure when the priest lays his hand on our head and says the triune formula that the grace is going, there's a kind of science of God that happens in the church liturgy, according to the Catholic's understanding of it. But that does not mean that any experience outside of those bounds is thereby suspect, right? There's a whole wide realm of supernatural things that can happen that the church has stated essentially like, that might have been God. Maybe that was God. Maybe what you experienced was the voice of God. And Catholicism like openly says that. That's probably God. Better if it's regulated. Better if we institutionally, like we stick primarily to the things that are within the bounds, because otherwise chaos ensues. And they're wise about that. But we're not going to disavow these other things just because they don't fit within the box, which is actually not how I grew up understanding what Catholicism was about. But as I've gotten older, like, oh, it's not as exclusionary. It's like Pope Francis recently gave this thing where he was talking to a bunch of folks in, I think it was in Thailand, and I might be mistaken on that for the record, but he said something like, we all worship the same God. That's not he's not being a universalist all of a sudden. He's being very Catholic. We do all worship the same God. It's just that the Catholic Church teaches there happens to be a proper way of doing these things. So that excursus on Catholicism for me is part of how I think about my own sense of my relationship to my charismatic practices, which is these things are part of this tradition of interacting with God that has real fruit, that has real phenomena, that has a supernatural reality behind it. It's just that the way the Pentecostals and Charismatics understood it, the way they interpreted it, the way they taught it, the way they tried to push it, or the way they tried to shove it into a certain kind of political or social framework, those things are all false, right? That part of it's just them. But they're not taking the glossolalia from me, right? That's the Holy Ghosts. So that I know that's not how all people who are post-Pentecostal and Charismatic are wrestling with it, but that's part of how I have been. I can't just reject some of these things because I don't have as much as I've gone down this intellectual journey, I can't deny some of the things that I've seen, witnessed, and experienced. I can certainly disavow some of the things I've been taught. And that's a little bit of where I've personally drawn the line. Although there's a skeptical side of me that wants to raise more questions on that too.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that is a really good place to end this. Unless you have any other thoughts that you'd like to get out, I think we've covered everything.
We have. Let me think for a hot minute. Oh, I don't know where this fits, but I want to think a little bit about visions, dreams, and words of God. In a kind of standard Pentecostal and Charismatic context, it is understood that God will communicate with you in a variety of ways. And you might have a dream, and God will communicate with you. You might have a vision. And people will talk about the difference between, say, a closed vision and an open vision. A closed vision being it's in your mind, open vision being it's in your eyes. And words of God, right? Like words popping to your mind and hearing them in your mind's eye or hearing them in your ear even. They'll distinguish between hearing a word from God in your mind and hearing a word from God in your ear as an audible word of God and all those sorts of things. And this is where I do get a little skeptical and actually skeptical in a thinking about psychology kind of sense. And I'm a little interested in thinking about how autistic people don't process their thoughts the same way as neurotypical people do. And I've sometimes wondered how much of my experiences in this manner of like feeling like I heard the word of God or feeling like I had a vision is actually wrapped up with the way that I don't process my thoughts normally. Does that make sense? As a thing, I don't know. Maybe that's a little too much for the podcast.
I think it's incredibly interesting. The difficulty for me is that I don't have a lot of data on the control group, so to speak.
Oh
So
no, that's right.
I can tell you all about the autistic people, but I can't really tell you about the non-autistic people. It's really hard for me to compare and contrast, but I think there's a lot there. So when you look particularly at autistic people who get into Christian mysticism versus non-autistic people who get into Christian mysticism, they get into it in very different ways and they express it in very different ways. And so I know mysticism isn't the same as like ecstatic experience, but I think you could draw a lot of parallels. And one of the things that comes up is just like sensory processing styles. And so autistic people who don't really particularly express themselves very well verbally will engage with the sort of more the contemplative mystical experiences through art in a way that other people don't necessarily do it because of the way that they're processing that information, and it leads to some things that I haven't fully sorted it out in my head just how to like properly explain these things, because I say that and then there's this voice of your inner like devil's advocate going, is this something that's unique to autistic people or is this a universal experience that you're misattributing? And
Yeah. That's something I'm also
yeah,
wrestling with bringing this topic up.
and
Because part of what I'm trying to wrestle with here is I am aware personally that I don't normally hear my thoughts. And I'm a very introspective and reflective person. So how can I be an introspective and reflective person in a kind of deep sense if I don't normally hear my thoughts? Um, and that so I could and I express this in like thinking about my processing and saying, and I'll say it's like to my wife or I'll say it to other people. I sometimes feel like if my head is a computer, it's like when the computer's fan is whirring, but you don't know what it's doing, right? And you open up the task manager, what are you doing? And it's like, oh, that's where my thoughts are. They're all the way back there in the background. They're whirring, but I don't have access to them. It's not something that I'm cognizant of. And I guess something I'm trying to filter through here is there a sense in which my spiritual side wants to say that's why God speaks to me in these ways on occasion, right? Because that's how I know that it's God. But then my skeptical or more materialist side of me, my psychological side of me wants to say, no, this is when a want pushes strong enough against that pressure that emerges. This is when a desire finally gets through and expresses itself in my mind. And so it has to be a very strong desire. It has to be a very powerful desire to overcome that kind of unconscious pressure. And I wonder how I wonder if that latter is plausible. I wonder how much that explains of charismatic and Pentecostal experiences in those particular forms. Because we do know in a straightforward sense that, for instance, some of these prophets are expressing hidden desires in their prophecies without necessarily being self-cognizant about it. I mean, in the case of someone like a Mike Bickle, I don't actually know that he's necessarily entirely self-aware of his own narcissism. But certainly not. Narcissists aren't aware of their own narcissism. But I sometimes wonder how much he truly believes in his own message or people like this. And I think some of them do, and thus can't distinguish between that internal monologue and the voice of God because of this distinction. But yeah, obviously it's not something we necessarily have data for. It has to run on anecdote, and even my anecdote with reservations.
Have you looked into alexithymia at all? Alexithymia it's a common thing autistic people have. It's like it's a thought processing and emotion processing deficit, I guess. I get so tripped up because people hate the word deficit. They don't like to say deficit, but
It describes it accurately.
yeah. Anyway, that might be of interest just because I know there's a large overlap. Yeah, I think there are a lot of questions that I think are just not answerable in a lot of these senses. And there's also a sense in just like a neurology from a neurology or like a neuroscience perspective, the actual is there a hard delineation between an autistic person and a non-autistic person when it comes to certain things? And the answer is pretty much in all cases yes, and also no. It's one of those places where the answer is for some autistic people or for groups of autistic people, there will likely be clusters of these things that manifest in certain ways, but for other groups and clusters of autistic people, there just won't be. So I think alexithymia is a good example of that because so alexithymia, I have high levels of alexithymia. So I often can't figure out what's going on inside of me and don't understand it. And like what you explained where the fan's whirring and there's background tasks going on in the back, but you're not exactly sure what is actually like you don't know what process is hogging all the RAM type of thing. That's like that's an experience I can relate to.
um,
Um,
I actually just had
and
the experience where I started taking some pills for anxiety, and I recently felt like strong anger and strong sadness in a way I don't actually remember ever feeling. It was really weird. I was like, this is supposed to be helping me with my anxiety. It's not supposed to be making me feel all these things. What are these things? But it was very shocking to me because I'm very even keel. Very and when I am moved, it has to be something really big, like a serious kind of major thing, and really okay. I think I'm, and usually I'm upset about this. That's usually my word. Usually that's the word I will use, but I don't normally fill that in with additions until unless I really work at it. Unless I really, yeah, I'm going to take this alexithymia test now.
All right. I think that's a good place to end this. It was good talking to you.
Yeah, I enjoyed it.
Yeah. See you later. All right. That is the episode. Thank you all again for listening to another episode of Christianity on the Spectrum. If you'd like to find me, you can find me at Christianity on the Spectrum at gmail.com. You can find me on Twitter at Christianity On and on Blue Sky at Christianity On. Additionally, we have a Discord. If you are interested in Discord or getting a link to it, you can just send me an email, christianityonthespectrum at gmail.com, and ask for a link, and I'll send it to you, or message me on Twitter or Blue Sky, and I'll send you a link. It's really cool. We just did a book club on Simone Weil and her book Awaiting God, and there are lots of really cool, fun conversations. So if that seems like something you want to be a part of, just let me know. All right. See ya. Bye.